Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. Before I head to the episode, I first wish to thank Kirsty Mills, an amazing supporter of the podcast, for providing the cover art for this episode. This will be a running theme going forwards, as to reflect one of the reasons for setting up the podcast, that being my curiosity regarding crimes that have occurred in places I live. I shall be announcing in the Facebook group going forwards the location of an upcoming episode. And then I'll be asking you, my lovely Northerners, to provide your own photos of that place. Whichever is selected shall be credited in the show notes and will get a mention on the episode, just like the wonderful Kirsty. So be sure to join the Facebook group It's Murder Up North, which will be linked in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing your incredible photos. Now to today's episode, which came about because whilst I was researching the case of Ernie Clark and creating a timeline for the 9 years during which 17-year-old Eileen McDougall remained hidden in plain sight, I came across 3 other murders that occurred in 1974, within months of each other. Over the next 3 episodes, I shall delve into each of these cases, starting with the murder of 8-year-old Julia Brown, a case which seems straightforward, but after looking into the details that emerged after the trial and the comments that were made regarding the victim, I, as someone who tried to remain unbiased, have to admit it made my blood boil. So join me as I disclose the details of the Julia Brown case. Eileen McDougall had been missing for 4 years when news broke on the 22nd of March 1974 that a body had been found on an allotment in South Shields. And while murmurs of the discovery may have filtered through to the family of the missing 17-year-old, whose hopes that this find may be the devastating conclusion to their search, it was swiftly established that the remains were those of 8-year-old Julia Scott Brown, who had failed to return home from school the previous day. Julia's 26-year-old mother, Heather, originally came from Manchester and had been married previously, with her former husband remaining in the city. Meanwhile, Heather had found love again with Peter Brown, a folk singer and art teacher, whom she met in the North Yorkshire town of Harrogate. Having remarried, the Browns relocated to the northeast town of South Shields when Julia was around 6 years old, and her youngest sibling was only 3 months of age. Over the next 15 months, Julia became the eldest of 5 children when another sibling was born, and having relocated to the town, the petite girl with shoulder-length locks of brown hair would become a pupil at Morebury Road Primary School, just a short walk from her terraced home on Westall Road. Mrs. Brown recalled that her intelligent eldest daughter had taken some time to settle into school, but by the time of her death, Julia had started to enjoy it, and she'd formed some new friendships with her mother, stating, quote, "She was one of those little girls that everyone seemed to take to." In January 1974, the enthusiastic and eager Julia became a member of the Glebe Church Brownies, with Mrs. Brenda Farr, the pack leader, proudly recalling that the 8-year-old was, quote, "a chirpy little bairn who enjoyed the brownies. She passed her first test to become a proper brownie inside a month, and usually it takes 3. She just had to learn the code to help people and do a good turn every day." Overall, Julia was a carefree and happy child, full of youthful energy and fun, with a shy yet friendly disposition. And when she headed out the front door on March the 21st with a spring in her step, she bid her mother goodbye with a little smile as the youngster traversed the 10-minute journey to school. The slightly built, brown-eyed girl arrived for her lessons that overcast morning with her usual enthusiasm, and when the bell signalled the end of the day, she smiled gently as the teacher told her pupils she would see them all in the morning. Accompanied by a friend, Julia made her way back towards her home, with the pair parting ways on the corner of Westall Road and Mowbray Road, within 30 yards of Julia's black and white front door. Yet the 8-year-old would not step over the threshold. When she didn't arrive home by 4 p.m, it was just assumed Julia had headed straight to a children's evening at the Mormon church. But when her parents learned that this was not the case, the police were contacted at 7 p.m, prompting a full-scale search. As Thursday passed into Friday, a thick fog descended, hampering the hunt for the 8-year-old. Yet, in the early hours of the 22nd of March, the search came to a tragic conclusion, when Julia's body was discovered about a mile away on the 135 plot Brinkburn allotments. Mr. Walter Alexander had been making his way to work and was cutting through the fog-bound allotments, intending to get to his garage, when he spotted the tiny figure lying face down beside a hedge. When detectives arrived at the scene shortly after the discovery, they noted that the young girl had suffered extensive injuries to her head and face, and her killer had made no attempt to hide her remains, nor did it appear as though her clothing had been disturbed. A provisional search of the area revealed no obvious signs of the weapon used in the attack, and aside from the body, the only other clue left behind was a shoe print in the mud close to where Julia lay. The thick blanket of fog acted as an eerie shroud over the scene. Residents awoke to see shadowy figures moving amidst its veil, the motions of police officers beginning to attempt to piece together what had happened to the happy little 8-year-old. While her family were informed of the devastating news, the task fell on her stepfather Peter to make a formal identification, which he did by viewing the clothing that was found on the body. These he confirmed had been the garments worn by Julia when she left for school the previous morning. Meanwhile, the pupils, parents and staff at Mowbray Road Primary School were informed of the incident, with headmistress Miss Elsie Agar issuing a warning to her students stating, "Don't speak to strangers, don't stray out of the playground. If any visitors come, bring them straight to me, and go straight home after school." For many of Julia's classmates, the innocent days of walking to and from school alone were now over, as frightened parents began to accompany them to the gates and be there waiting for them at home time. Within hours of Julia being found, the police set up a press conference, during which Detective Superintendent William Connor, who was leading the inquiry, appealed for help from members of the public, especially anyone who may have seen Julia, or anyone acting unusually around Mowbray Road or near the allotments, going on to ask parents to speak to their children, many of whom had a tendency of using the allotments as a play area, whether they had seen anything which may be significant to the investigation. Detectives also spoke to the family in order to learn more about Julia, and they learned from her mother that although the 8-year-old was friendly and polite to strangers, she would not go anywhere with someone she did not know, recalling a time when, quote, "She got lost some years ago. Police found her, but she refused to even go near them." The last known sighting of Julia was just after 4 p.m. by her school friend who left her within yards of her front door, and despite the route they had walked being populated by other pupils, the police had encountered no one who had seen anything which may have suggested a stranger abduction. This assumption was strengthened by Julia's mother's assertion that her daughter wouldn't have willingly gone off with a stranger. Therefore, it was theorized Julia knew her killer. In an effort to establish what may have occurred, the 8-year-old's route from her school gates up to the point where she was last seen was retraced, with people along the way being stopped and questioned. while other officers conducted door-to-door inquiries in the hopes that someone may have seen or heard something. Amidst their inquiries, they spoke to 5 school children who had allegedly seen Julia in the company of a man walking along Lord Street, which was a road she would have had to pass on her way home from school. Unfortunately, the children were unable to provide a coherent description of the individual seen with Julia that Thursday afternoon. Yet the most definitive features they conveyed was that the male was between 30 and 40 years of age, average height and build, dressed in a smart suit and overcoat, and had been wearing glasses. As officers sought further details regarding this man, attention was also focused on the allotments, with owners being asked to check their plots for anything missing or disturbed. Meanwhile, detectives were able to build up a clearer picture of what may have occurred. Assessing the allotments, they deemed that due to access issues, it was unlikely that the killer had driven a car onto the grounds with the aim of disposing of the already deceased child, drawing the conclusion that it was more probable Julia was alive when she and her killer had gotten to the location. They were also furnished with information by 2 men who had been passing through the allotments between 6:30 and 7 p.m. on the evening Julia had disappeared. They stated they had walked near to where the body had been found, yet at that time had seen no one in the area. This information helped to narrow down the timeline as to when Julia and her killer may have arrived at the allotments. Other witnesses reported seeing a group of boys on bikes near the allotments that night, which led to an appeal for these individuals to come forwards. During the appeal, Detective Superintendent William Connor would emphasise that, quote, "We will not stop until the killer is found," adding that Julia wasn't the sort of girl to go off with a stranger. She would know whoever she went off with. One possibility, which had to be ruled out, was the potential involvement of Heather Brown's ex-husband, as it is often the case that someone close to the victim is the culprit. Yet this was swiftly ruled out when the man was found to not live locally and had not been in the area at the time. With one lead concluded, there was other questions which needed to be answered. Not only did they need to ascertain the identity of the killer, but they needed to determine how the 8-year-old had ended up at the allotments. Had she been led there, or had the murder occurred elsewhere, with the body secreted there afterwards? Either way, the police concluded that given the extensive injuries inflicted to the child, the perpetrator would have had bloodstains on his clothing. As officers took to the streets in hopes of moving the investigation forwards, Home Office pathologist Dr. John Ferris conducted a post-mortem examination, through which he deduced that the injuries to the 8-year-old's face had been caused by the impact of her body hitting the ground after she had been rendered unconscious and fallen from a standing position. This detail and the location of the blows to the head led Dr. Ferris to determine that the attack had started while the girl was standing, and that the several strokes issued to her skull had caused fractures and hemorrhaging, which he deemed to be Julia's cause of death. As more details regarding the case became known, the family's anguish only grew, with Julia's mother making an impassioned plea, quote, "Don't stare at my children," adding, "The children can't go out or even look out the window without people pointing and staring at them. The headmistress had to keep them in the classroom on the day Julia died, because the children were pointing at them. And my son Lawrence went to the shop over the road last night, and it happened then also. It's most embarrassing, and I don't want my other children to feel that they are some sort of circus. I know people don't mean to be unkind, but they are, and it has upset us no end." Mrs. Brown also disclosed that Julia's younger siblings had been informed about their sister's death, with them being told by their mother, quote, "She had bumps on her head, but she had now gone to heaven and she was all right." The mother proceeded by adding that through their Mormon faith, The children had an understanding of death, and it was this faith which was providing them comfort through this difficult time, stating that our faith has helped us enormously, because we believe that death is only the beginning. We feel that life goes on, and we will meet Julia again, eventually. While the family sought solace in their religion, they also hoped for answers, and these would begin to emerge just 3 days after the 8-year-old's disappearance, when a man handed himself in to police and confessed to the killings. He would be named for the first time on Monday the 25th of March 1974, as he appeared in court charged with the murder. This appearance coincided with a press conference held by DS William Connor, whom confirmed that a man by the name of Peter O'Leary had been brought into the station by Police Sergeant David Deacon, an officer who would inform the inquest held the following day that aside from his duties with the police, he was also a bishop in the Mormon church, and it was through the church that he was acquainted with both Julia and Peter O'Leary. With the man charged for the murder and the inquest into the little girl's death concluded, the family were able to say their goodbyes to Julia in a private funeral held on the weekend of the 31st of March. But their grief could not yet be laid to rest, as they awaited the trial of the man who had taken her life. But as the judicial process trundled slowly along, more details emerged about the perpetrator, who appeared in court on the 9th of May 1974 to face an additional charge under Section 14 of the Sexual Offences Act, as he stood accused of indecently assaulting Julia Brown in July 1973, 8 months prior to her murder. The details of this charge and his connection with his victim would come to light during his trial, held at Teesside Crown Court on Monday the 8th of July 1974. Standing before Judge Mr. Justice Mays, Paul Henry O'Leary entered a plea of not guilty to murder but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, a submission which had been accepted by the prosecution. It was the task of Mr. Angus Stroyan QC, as prosecutor, to outline the Crown's case against O'Leary. Mr. Stroyan informed the court that on the 1st of March 1974, O'Leary had collected a tax rebate from his employer and then left the home he shared with his mother and stepfather, and did not return until the 24th of March, 3 days after the murder of Julia. Where he had been during these 3 weeks is uncertain, but O'Leary had been known to sleep rough previously. The prosecution went on to detail O'Leary's actions on the day of the murder, advising that the defendant had met Julia Brown as she was about to make her way up the steps to her house, and he had convinced her to accompany him, with O'Leary proceeding to take the 8-year-old girl on a 14-mile trip by bus and on foot. The court heard that the pair was seen by several people, including a bus driver who observed them board his vehicle and was acquainted with O'Leary. Through witness sightings and the defendant's own words, his journey with Julia was tracked, as the pair travelled to South Shields, North Shields, Tynemouth and Willington Quay, with their final destination being the Brinkburn allotments, which sits behind houses on Mortimer Road in South Shields, with Julia last being seen alive at around 10:30 that evening. Upon arrival at the allotments, O'Leary claimed he saw a house brick on the ground and felt an urge to pick it up. He alleged he carried it for some time, as they made their way through the site, but when Julia walked ahead of him, he became compelled to strike her with the brick, hitting the girl in the back of the head, which caused the 8-year-old to fall to the ground. O'Leary went on to claim that he simply walked away, leaving the girl to lie in the dark and lonely allotments. As he walked along, he realised he was still clutching the brick, which he discarded before leaving the area. Having been absent from his family home for 3 weeks, O'Leary walked through the front door on Sunday the 24th of March and was clearly out of sorts, as he instructed his brother to contact the former bishop of the Mormon Church in South Shields, David Deacon. Upon Sergeant Deacon's arrival at the home, O'Leary stated, "I am ready to come with you. I'll get my coat." When asked why, he responded, "Because I killed Julia Brown. Don't ask me why I did it, because I just don't know." O'Leary was cautioned by Sergeant Deacon, who advised him that despite having confided in a church official, he had also confessed to an officer of the law, and that was how the issue must be dealt with. Seemingly unperturbed by this, O'Leary willingly accompanied Sergeant Deacon to the police station, where he confessed to his actions. After being interviewed, O'Leary was taken to the allotments, where he pointed out where he had acquired the house brick, which was near to the entrance. He also claimed that upon arriving at the site with Julia, he had, quote, half an idea that he was going to kill her. However, he wasn't certain until he picked up the brick. To try and rationalise his actions, he claimed he became aware that the girl's parents would be concerned for her whereabouts, and he knew he should have taken her home. But he stated, "I realised it was getting late and Julia's parents would be worried about her. She was my responsibility. I think I chickened out. I saw a house brick lying on the ground. I picked it up and bashed Julie on the head with it. I bashed her from behind. She gave a yell." Mr. Stroyan told the court it was possible that the defendant had sexually assaulted the child, possibly after she was dead, with the prosecutor providing further context as to why O'Leary may have feared being caught with the 8-year-old. It was disclosed that the 37-year-old man had indecently assaulted Julia in July the previous year. However, this had not been reported to the police, with Mr. Stroyan advising the court, quote, "It appears that it was dealt with by the resources of the church and proceedings were not taken." Prosecutor Mr. Stroyan continued by describing O'Leary as being a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character, an intellectual man who was prone to make irrational decisions and was erratic in his actions. It was said that the defendant had a tattoo which bore the name Julie on his wrist, but it could not be said whether this referred to the 8-year-old or another individual of that name. Aside from his unusual behaviour, the court also heard that the defendant had 6 prior convictions, primarily for theft and dishonesty. Following on from the prosecution's presentation, the defence counsel, Mr. Wilfred Steer QC, began their case, stating that they did not contest the accusation that his client had been responsible for the death of Julia, but he would argue that the crime occurred while the defendant was impaired, stating, "You are not dealing with a man who is an animal because of the vile condition of his mind, or one who cannot think. You will see from what is said in the reports about his superior range of intelligence. Also, you are not dealing with a man who has been entirely divorced from social work. This is his membership of the church and some activity in political life." The defence counsel went on to claim O'Leary was not a threat to anyone and was, quote, "certainly not a man to be locked away without help," adding that the defendant did not suffer from any mental illness or abnormal thinking. However, the doctors who had assessed him recommended therapeutic treatment. With regards to the crime O'Leary stood accused of, the defence stated that the death of Julia was, quote, "a combination of unfortunate circumstances." Having heard from the prosecution and defence, with both sides accepting the plea of guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, Judge Mays turned his attention to Paul Henry O'Leary, who stood passively in the dock as the case was summed up and sentencing was issued. Addressing the defendant, Mr. Justice Mays stated, "We had accepted your plea of diminished responsibility. On March 21st, you killed that little girl by fracturing her skull with a brick, which you had carried for some distance. The reason why you did so is obscure. There seems little or no motive. The reason for the indecent assault is also obscure, except you had an inclination to interfere with little girls. You have interfered with her in the past. and there had been remonstrations about it. You failed to heed them. Having outlined the nature of the crime, Justice Mayes focused the speech upon O'Leary's character, stating, "You are intelligent. You have a psychopathic personality disorder and sexual deviations. You are not naturally violent. You are in need of treatment. The public must be protected from you." Going on to point out the unpredictable nature of the defendant, the judge stated, "There seems at the moment no real means of knowing what you might do. You must go to prison, where you will receive, in due course, treatment. I do not see this as a case for a determinate period of imprisonment." Alongside this decision, O'Leary was also issued a concurrent sentence of 12 months for the indecent assault against Julia in July 1973. This was an incident which would have additional consequences, given that it had gone unreported by the Mormon Church, and I shall come back to this shortly. But first, let's take a closer look at the man who took Julia's life. 37-year-old Paul Henry O'Leary was an individual who was seeking his place in the world. He had the intellect, but he also had the tendency for self-sabotage through irrational or erratic actions. Described as a small, pale, and bespectacled individual, he was, quote, "one of life's misfits." O'Leary had spent his early childhood living in the Green Lane area of South Shields with his grandmother, Mrs. B.T. Jukes. The youngster formed a close bond with his grandmother, who was his primary carer, while his mother, Harriet, worked nearly 300 miles away in London. When O'Leary was roughly 7 years old, his mother would marry her second husband, Franz Albert Schindler Chambers, known as Albert. He was described as a kind-hearted labourer who accepted the boy as his own, but after moving in with his mother and her new husband, O'Leary struggled to settle, and his discomfort only grew with the subsequent births of his stepbrothers Albert, David and Jerry. Unable to feel at home with his new family, whenever he encountered difficulties, Paul would often run away, returning to his grandmother's home on each occasion, and this inability to face his problems would follow him into adulthood. While he struggled to find his place in the home, Paul would also be isolated at school. His small, frail stature and quiet nature made him a target for bullies at Cleedon Park Secondary School. As one former pupil recalled, that Paul was, quote, "the natural target for bullies because he wasn't strong enough to fight back." When he finished school, Paul secured work, first as a messenger with the Tyne Pilotage Authority, and then at a shipyard where he operated as a junior clerk. However, when he was 17 years old, he was summoned for national service, with him joining the Navy, where the bullying of his high school days returned. One man who served alongside Paul remembered the treatment his fellow servicemen received, stating, "Lads doing national service were unpopular to start with. As soon as people realised how meek and mild he was, he became a natural scapegoat. It wasn't fair, but that's the way people like Henry are treated by the world." Unable to fit in amidst his fellow naval officers, O'Leary completed his mandatory term of service and headed back to South Shields, where he volunteered to help with the Sea Cadets. However, this would be one of a number of roles he would leave in unfavourable circumstances, the details of which the Sea Cadets did not wish to disclose. The cadets, like the Navy, high school and family life prior, were all areas in which O'Leary was unable to find his place, and this pattern seemed to continue in his working life, as he flitted from one job to the next, going from working for South Shields Corporation Transport as a conductor to a railway porter at Paddington. While these roles fizzled out, he returned to working at the dockyards, but instead of utilising his intellect as a clerk, he became a labourer, and by July of 1963 he underwent a government training programme in order to become a capstone setter operator. It was a skilled role which required an understanding of the machinery and how it operated. He would utilise this training in order to secure work as a capstone operator, and momentarily it seemed he had found something he could make a go of. By 1965, Paul was still residing with his mother and stepfather at the family home in Lumley Avenue, South Shields, and from this tidy, three-bedroom, semi-detached home, he would often accompany his siblings to the Rose and Crown pub situated at the end of their road. One woman who remembered O'Leary's visits to the pub was Mrs. Alma Phones, who had known the family for several years. Speaking after his conviction, Alma recalled how O'Leary would come and sit with the women in the corner of the pub, stating, "He was a grand lad, always pleasant and intelligent too. He could talk to us about any subject under the sun." Alma, like many people who knew Paul, found it hard to comprehend such a mild-mannered man being capable of murder, with Alma recalling that Paul had been a doting uncle to his brother's 4 children, with her adding, quote, "He worshipped those bairns. In fact, he loved all the youngsters. That's why no one in the pub could believe he killed that little girl. The last thing Harry would do would be to harm a kiddie. He was one of the nicest lads I've ever met." Yet behind the facade of a pleasant young man was an individual who would struggle to stay on the right side of the law, with his first encounter in the dock occurring in June 1965, as he stood accused of stealing £5. As this was O'Leary's first offence, he was placed on probation for 2 years, but just 3 months later he breached his terms when he was charged with storehouse breaking and theft. This time he would be ordered to serve 3 months for the crime and an additional 6 months due to him breaching the conditions of his probation. Following his release from prison, Paul would once again seek to find his place in the world. Alongside this, he strove to make amends to his family for the shame he had brought upon them. Now in his final year of his 20s, O'Leary became eager to make a name for himself, and in 1967, he began working at the Tyne Improvement Commission at Tyne Dock in South Shields. He also found a new interest, with him joining the 2,500 members of the General and Municipal Workers' Union. Aside from becoming invested in workers' rights, Paul exercised his political leanings by joining the South Shields Labour Party and Trades Council, to which he had been introduced by former town councillor Malcolm Campbell, with whom he had attended high school and had served alongside on a naval minesweeper. The pair had become reacquainted through the Tyne Improvement Commission, with Mr. Campbell being impressed by the enthusiasm which O'Leary showed regarding the trade union, the kind of spirit that he felt would be suited within the Labour Party. O'Leary threw himself into political life wholeheartedly, participating in events and furthering his ability to debate key issues by consuming socialist literature. Through his determination, he quickly rose through the ranks, taking over the position of treasurer upon the retirement of Mrs. Elizabeth Diamond. Having been elected to such a trusted position, it seemed O'Leary had put his past indiscretions behind him, and he had started to find his footing. But this was not the case in all aspects of his life, as the 30-year-old was still a bachelor residing with his parents. It seems he did not have many relationships or interactions with women, as recalled by a factory worker who went on a couple of dates with O'Leary. And during an interview following his murder conviction, she stated, "I met him through a girlfriend and her husband. This couple asked me to make up the numbers for a foursome with O'Leary to go to 2 social functions. I thought he was very quiet indeed. In fact, he seemed painfully shy. When the others talked, he didn't join in the conversation." She went on to describe the dates further, adding, "I am quiet myself, so we didn't have much to say on either occasion. We didn't dance, and I noticed that he didn't drink very much. He was a pleasant enough man, but we never met again. He simply wasn't my type." Despite seeming painfully shy, in 1968, Paul Henry O'Leary stood for election as the Labour Party candidate in the town's Beacon ward, with his campaign accompanied by leaflets adorned with his photograph, which was distributed throughout the area, making him a recognisable individual as his prominence grew. During his election speech, he described his position as the treasurer for the South Shields Labour Party and the secretary of the Fabian Society. The latter describes themselves as a left-leaning think tank dedicated to new public policy and political ideas, who are a democratically governed socialist society, a Labour affiliate and one of the party's original founders. Paul would stand against his rival candidate, Alderman George Rossiter, and during his election speech, the introverted 30-year-old stated, "This is the first time I have offered my services as a municipal candidate, and because of this I feel I have something to offer," adding, especially in the proposed reorganisation of local government. But his prospects for victory were very slim, as the Beacon ward was a progressive stronghold, and despite Paul dedicating himself completely to the campaign, he was unable to secure the votes, resulting in just 207 against Alderman Rossiter's 1,087. The election defeat would not signal the end of his political career, but his actions shortly afterwards would, when it was discovered following an audit that money was missing from the accounts. Rather than face the issue, O'Leary opted to flee from it, disappearing to Northumberland, where he took to sleeping rough in Alnwick and Blythe before handing himself in to the police 2 weeks later and confessing to the theft of £70. His friend Malcolm Campbell expressed his own opinion on what occurred, stating that he believed, quote, "O'Leary panicked. He thought he was going to be blamed, so he took all the cash and ran off. It was the clumsiest crime I have ever seen." Mr. Campbell also expressed the belief that it should not have been dealt with as a criminal matter, but instead believed O'Leary required medical treatment, recalling he was a bundle of nerves and needed medical help. The poor bloke was always on the outside looking in. It was this arrest and his 6-month prison sentence for embezzlement which some felt affected O'Leary and contributed towards the death of Julia Brown, with Mr. Campbell unable to conceive how the man whom he had trusted to look after his children, with them referring to him as Uncle Henry, would be capable of harming a child. The old friend would tell the press, in the aftermath of the guilty verdict, "The murder was terrible, but somehow it could all have been avoided if he had received help. I cannot help feeling sorry for him." Another acquaintance echoed this sentiment. Opposing the sentence O'Leary received for the embezzlement, the friend stated, "It was obvious to me that he was under pressure and had cracked up. He should have been helped instead of locked away. It was obvious that he had a personality problem. The prison sentence did no good at all. In fact, it broke him." Condemning the judicial system, the friend continued, "Society and our legal system are to blame for what happened to Henry O'Leary in the end. This tragedy need never have happened if people had tried to understand his problems. He was crying out for help at the time of this offence, but no one could be bothered with him." This friend was not alone in feeling that O'Leary's cries for help were ignored, with his mother, Mrs. Harriet Chambers, insisting that had her son received the psychiatric help she had requested for him following his incarceration for embezzlement, then the murder may not have occurred, recalling that, quote, "I asked the court for medical treatment for him last time he was in trouble. I said his behaviour was out of character and that he needed help, but nobody took any notice." His mother continued her lament for her son's circumstances by stating, "I can't help thinking that if he had been given the treatment he needed, that this tragedy would never have happened. I think a young life has been lost needlessly because Paul was not given help." Upon completing his prison term, O'Leary was back at square one, lost and without purpose. That was until he walked into the Mormon church in Beach Road, South Shields. Now 35 years old, he had found a new path to take, and as he had done within the Labour Party and trade union, he enveloped himself in the faith. O'Leary studied Mormonism, wanting to gain a deeper understanding of its practices, and in doing so he became further ingratiated with the congregation. He assisted in caring for those who were ill or in need, and also volunteered at the Senior Youth Club on Tuesday evenings, assisting in its running and providing teaching alongside Julia's mother. As the details of O'Leary's crimes came to light, an official from the church addressed the concerns regarding the disclosure that the now convicted murderer had been permitted to work in close proximity with children. Defending this decision, the official stated, he would always make sure that they got home at the right time after a function. He was an enthusiastic person and his work in the youth club could not be faulted. Yet in July 1973, trust in O'Leary would be shaken, when allegations were made against him regarding inappropriate actions towards Julia Brown, the details of which I shall elaborate on shortly. However, when these complaints were raised to a church official, it was not escalated further, and O'Leary was permitted to continue his rise in prominence within the church. Just a couple of months after the alleged incident with Julia had occurred, O'Leary was appointed to the position of church counsellor, making him one of two men assigned to assist Bishop Robert Johnson. O'Leary's future was looking promising, with his engagement to Miss Lorraine Dodsworth coinciding with his appointment as counsellor. Miss Dodsworth, who worked in a factory, had met O'Leary via the church, and in the months leading up to the murder the couple had begun planning their lives together, seeking out a home and setting a wedding date. But it all came to an end in February 1974, within weeks of his heinous crime. And he dealt with the split in his usual manner, leaving the comfort of his family home and opting to live on the streets. Given the brief passage of time between his relationship ending and Julia's death, it is worth considering whether the breakup had impacted his personality disorder, and this had contributed to his actions when he took the little girl's life. The day after Julia's murder, police came to O'Leary's home, with his mother informing them that he wasn't there, but he would return when he was ready. This her son subsequently did, but Mrs. Chambers recognised that something was troubling him, stating, "When he did come home, I knew something was wrong, but I still didn't think it was that. He asked us to get Sergeant Deacon because he wanted to give himself up." Even in the light of his actions, Mrs. Chambers remained loyal to her child, telling the press, "I am standing by my son. He is intelligent and conscientious, but life has never gone right for him. But he has been a good son, and I have been proud of him." She would, however, lament her son's inability to communicate his problems in an appropriate manner, saying, "He never talked about his problems and kept everything to himself. If he had troubles, he used to go off and sleep rough from time to time, and stay by himself until he had sorted things out. I didn't like him doing this, but I realised it was the way he solved things." A neighbour would also speak to the press in the days following the murder conviction, and defended O'Leary's family, stating, "Harriet doesn't believe that he could have done this. He is a gentle person and a good son. He worshipped his mother. Harriet and Albert brought their lads up to be respectable, and no one in the neighbourhood can say a bad word about this family." Whether the prison term for embezzlement or the end of his engagement affected his personality disorder is not something I'm qualified to confirm. However, one thing is certain, O'Leary finding his place within the Mormon Church put him in contact with Julia Brown. Having worked alongside her mother at the youth nights, O'Leary became someone the family lightly felt they could trust. Yet in July 1973, that was called into question, and it would emerge that one man had been notified of the incident between O'Leary and Julia, and yet he dealt with it as an official of the church rather than an officer of the law. Sergeant Dave Deacon would face questions in the aftermath of O'Leary's conviction, after admitting that he had been aware that the killer had sexually assaulted Julia just a matter of months prior to the murder. At the time of the incident, it was discussed privately between Sergeant Deacon and O'Leary, with the latter disclosing that while on South Shields Beach, he had touched Julia's body. The bishop and police officer would claim that the incident in July 1973 was not reported to the police at the behest of Mrs. Brown, who allegedly, quote, insisted that I shouldn't do anything about it. The incident was, I thought, a trivial one, and I didn't think there was enough evidence to support a prosecution. He went on to support this assumption by adding that the then 7-year-old Julia was, quote, a bit romantic, and her story could not be corroborated. It was therefore agreed that no further action was required and the matter would not be disclosed to the congregation. The church did, however, take some additional precautions, with O'Leary no longer permitted to be left alone with a child, nor situated in close proximity to one during a group setting. Perhaps in an attempt to defend the decisions made, Sergeant Deacon stated that O'Leary was a dedicated Mormon and did a lot of good, adding that Julia's mother had, quote, thought a great deal before she told me about the story Julia had told her. However, he also stated that a sex offence can be anything, a pat on the bottom even. It was not a serious offence and our church does not feel in any way responsible. Nobody could possibly guess that O'Leary would murder her. It had been known by the church officials, including Sergeant Deacon, that O'Leary had failed to attend services and events at the church in the weeks leading up to the murder, and it was Sergeant Deacon, while attending a prayer meeting in Sunderland, who would receive a call from O'Leary's brother 3 days after the death, requesting he came to see the 37-year-old. One has to wonder whether the officer already had suspicions before stepping foot into the house, where Paul O'Leary handed himself in and confessed not only to the murder, but also to sexually assaulting Julia in July 1973. No longer was it a trivial matter, but now an issue for the court, and would signal the end of Sergeant Deacon's career as a police officer. At a private disciplinary hearing held before Northumbria Chief Constable Mr. Clarence Cooksley, Sergeant Deacon was found guilty of neglecting his duty as a police officer, with him being given the option to either resign his position or face dismissal. The 41-year-old father of 6 had to make the decision during the hearing, and opted to resign his post after 14 years of service. He defended his actions and claimed that no one would have known that O'Leary would kill Julia. One has to wonder what would have happened if the words of the 7-year-old girl had been believed. Thank you for listening to It's Murder Up North. Join me next time as we return to the northeast of England.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.